Hello everyone and welcome to this short coverage of the Corus tournament of 2010. We already know that Magnus Carlsen won with a very nice result of 8.5 out of 13, and now we reach the point where he faces former world champion Vladimir Kramnik. And if you count all the years together, counting the Professional Chess Association and FIDE, Kramnik reigned as world champion from the year 2000 when he took the title away from Garry Kasparov to 2007. But in 2007 there was no match. No one actually challenged him for the title. Rather, there was a tournament, a double round robin, where Vishwanathan Anand won and took away the title from Vladimir Kramnik. So he didn't really took it away from him. It's just that they said, all right, enough of this nonsense. Let's have a nice tournament, see who is the best, and he will be a world champion from this point onward. And then they again returned to the matches, and we still use matches to determine the world champion nowadays for classical chess. But yeah, incredibly strong. Even at he lost his World Chess Championship title in 2007. Still almost 2800 here, so. Very, very strong player. And it's very different when you face someone who was world champion or who is on his way of becoming world champion than any other top-rated player in the world. There just is that a little bit of elegance, a little bit of difference, and you'll see what I mean by this in this game. So let's check it out. Young 2800 Magnus opens with pawn to d4. This is round 9. We already covered some of the games from the tournament. If you haven't seen them, of course, do check them out. I do encourage you. In round 8, he got a draw against Shirov, and now Kramnik is next to face Magnus. So let's see what happens. We have knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, and pawn to d5. And Magnus goes for pawn to g3, the Catalan opening, and Magnus playing Catalan with white. I mean, I'm sure you agree there's nothing more terrifying in chess. And there are a couple of good continuations nowadays, and also back in 2010, bishop to e7, bishop to b4, and just captures on c4 are the top three. Kramnik goes for d captures on c4, and now bishop to g2. Now again, here you have a variety of options. You could go a6, c5, knight to c6. Kramnik goes for bishop to b4, also one of the popular continuations. Bishop to d2 blocking, and pawn to a5 defending the bishop. And here Magnus plays an incredibly rare move, one that definitely was a preparation move for this game. He plays knight to c3, and the only other game where this was employed was in 2009, so a year before this game was played. Also against Vladimir Kramnik, it was played by none other than Boris Gelfand. He played it against Kramnik in the Tal Memorial Tournament, and their game ended in a draw. But okay, here we have castles, and now comes pawn to a3. In the game that I mentioned, bishop to g5 was played by Boris Gelfand, but here Magnus plays a3, and it is now, well, as of move 8, that we have a completely new game. So let's see what happens. Bishop back to e7, or rather, it's not a completely new game. There are a couple of lower rated games that reach this position, and also one game that Grishuk played, but we're gonna get to that. So here, queen to a4, preparing to win back the pawn. Pawn to c6, preparing pawn to b5, queen captures, and pawn to b5. And now we reach that point, but the reason why I said it's not a completely new game, because Grishuk reached this position, but after this game was played. So when this game was actually played, Magnus's move was the new move, queen to b3. In that game, Grishuk sort of improved with queen to d3. Both queen to d3 and queen to b3 are the top moves recommended by the engine, and nowadays the engine says queen to d3 is a little bit more precise. But who knows, in those days they used Rybka, who knows what Rybka recommended, probably queen to b3, as Magnus played all of these moves, like 11 moves. He spent only 4 minutes on the clock, so Magnus was very, very well prepared. And okay, bishop to a6, and now bishop to g5, preparing to take the knight here. And yes, it is giving up the bishop pair, but it will come with a very nice trick, as you'll see. Knight b to d7, and bishop captures on f6. And this puts Kramnik in a very weird situation where he could capture with the bishop, but if he captures with the bishop, then knight e4 comes. You have this unpleasant pressure here, and once the bishop moves, you just castle, and you have this wonderful knight on e4. On the other hand, if you capture with the knight, you lose control of the e5 square, and then after knight e5, you just have a different set of problems, well, the usual problems when facing the Catalan. So here, Kramnik played g captures on f6. And okay, looks a bit weird, weakens the king, but Magnus's queen is on b3, The pawn is on g3, so you don't really expect to see some sort of a pawn storm here, and he will probably castle kingside, so you don't have to worry about weakening your king. We have queen to c2, and now pawn to b4. Grabs more space on the queen side, knight to a4, and rook to c8, now defending the c6 pawn. We have castles by Magnus, and now pawn to c5. And now Magnus has to figure out how to go about this. You don't really want to capture on c5. If you capture, then just knight captures, and Kramnik's position is wonderful. Especially if you capture further, then you just fully mobilize the bishop pair, and this is a recipe for disaster. So after c5, Magnus went for this beautiful pawn to d5 sacrifice, where you have to really figure out how to go about this position. And if you ask our good friend the engine, best is to play bishop to b5. But I'm not going to tell you why. You will see in the game. Here, Kramnik played e captures on d5, and now Magnus can grab control of this game, but only if he finds the correct move. So for target practice, feel free to pause the video and figure out what would you play here. If you were Magnus in this position playing against former world champion Vladimir Kramnik, what would you play here? While I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding a move that even Magnus could not play. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook f to d1. That's the move. Magnus played bishop to h3, which is also very nice, but just to show you why this move is strong, you of course go after the pawn, and makes sense. The queen is on d8, you want to win back material. And now after black plays d4, which of course makes sense, the c5 is guarded. Later on, maybe you can play c4, c3, and you're up a pawn. The problem is queen to f5 now is very annoying, because what do you play next? Let's say rook to e8. Now comes knight captures on d4. That's the problem. This is how you win your pawn back. And after c captures, now you play rook captures on d4. You pin the knight, and next, of course, you can capture the knight, but also you can play bishop to e4, followed by queen captures on h7. And the knight will not be able to go to f8 as the knight is pinned. So here, black will have to play queen to c7 to unpin. Now bishop to e4 can be met with knight to f8, but now you just win back the piece. Rook captures on d7, and after queen to e5, which is pretty much forced, queen captures, f captures, and you can even trade further, like bishop to b7, for example, captures, and if rook to c2 going after the e2 pawn, king f1, the knight nicely covers b2, white is up a pawn, white will be playing for the win in this game. So rook f to d1 was the move that you could have played here. However, Magnus played bishop to h3, and now it's a little bit different, as Kramnik finds bishop to b5. And this is a really strong defensive idea. Now, the problem is you don't have any of the moves that you had prior to this, because now if you just go rook f to d1, you can just play this. And there's no knight captures on d4, as already the queen is on c2. But even if you had the queen on f5, the bishop would be defending the knight. So all the moves that we've seen in the previous variation do not apply here. So a captures on b4, a captures, and rook f to d1 now by Magnus, but now Vladimir just plays pawn to d4, and he's not worried about knight captures on d4. The knight here is nicely defended, and if you don't have to worry about that, there's no knight captures on d4. So bishop to f5 by Magnus, that was the idea behind bishop to h3, going after the h7 pawn. Now comes knight to e5, and look at this. Bishop captures on h7 with check, and now king to g7. This is the correct move. King to h8 would be definitely suboptimal, because if you play king to h8, then after bishop to f5 attacking the rook, you don't have d3. We'll show in the other line why you have it, but now the problem is queen to d2, and you have queen to h8 check. If the king was on g7, there wouldn't be this, and you would not be having any problems. So that's why Vladimir played king to g7, and now knight captures on e5. Like I said, now bishop to f5 will just be met with d3, and the problem is after bishop captures on d3, bishop captures on d3, and rook captures on d3, you cannot play pawn captures, because then you blunder the knight with check. The pawn is defending the knight. You're going to have to play rook captures, and you're going to have to give up the exchange here. So black will be better here. So after king to g7, knight captures on e5, and now f captures on e5. Vladimir fixes his pawn structure, and okay, his king is a bit loose, but you still have to work very hard to actually get to that black king. So bishop to f5 attacks the rook, and now look at this. Rook to c6, also with the idea of rook to f6, and now comes queen to e4. And how do you continue here? The e5 pawn is hanging, and there was a lot of discussion about this position during the game and after the game, because these games were also followed live and people could comment on various websites. Here, Kramnik played rook to h8, and he sacrificed the e5 pawn. And this looks like something impossible, especially when your opponent is Magnus Carlsen. The problem is you can't really defend it with f6. This weakens the light squares a bit too much, and you're just gonna get checkmated here. However, you could play queen to c7 and just defend the pawn, and there's really nothing here. If queen to g4 check, you can even give up the exchange with rook to g6. And after captures, you have the bishop pair, you have the rook on the semi-open f-file, you have the pawns in the center ready to be pushed. Black is the one to be preferred here. But Kramnik played rook to h8. Beautiful move, and I've checked online, and even in those days, Rybka agreed with Kramnik's decision to give up the central pawn, which is just amazing to find this over the board. Queen captures on e5 with check, bishop to f6, and now queen to e4, again putting pressure on the rook, so you have to be careful of what you do with the bishop. Rook to e8, attacking the queen, going after the e2 pawn, and now queen to g4 with check. King to f8, and now Magnus has to figure out what to play. Can he go bishop d7 and skewer the rooks, or does he go back bishop to e4? He didn't go for bishop to d7, he played bishop to e4. The problem with bishop to d7 is that you also run into a skewer. Bishop captures on e2, attacks the queen and the rook, and once you move the queen, bishop captures on d1. And now after, and you have to recapture, otherwise rook to e1, a check is coming. So rook captures on d1, and now after rook e to e6, okay, you will capture, f captures, and still it is black who is better here, like queen to h6 check, you can play bishop to g7, and if queen to f4 check, king to g8, and again, the pawns are marching forward, there's no stopping them. So after king to f8, bishop to e4 was played. Okay, you're still attacking the rook, and now you've prevented bishop captures on e2, but here comes pawn to c4. Incredibly strong move by Vladimir, sacrificing the exchange here. Bishop captures on c6 was played, bishop captures, and now queen to h5. Here, with g3 being played and the light squares being weakened, queen to d5 will just be really annoying here. So Magnus stops it, he plays queen to h5, guards the d5 square, but now rook to e5 attacks the queen, also reclaims the d5 square for black's queen, queen to h6 check, and now king to e7. Here, maybe the first suboptimal move by Vladimir, the king on g8 would be much safer. But he played king to e7, and now he allowed Magnus maybe the possibility of a stubborn defense. And what I mean by this is queen to d2 can be played. And now the point is, if queen to d5, you can play f3, and if c3, you can play queen to d3. Looks very ugly, and black is still to be preferred here, but maybe you can still play it. And of course, you cannot win a pawn here, because if bishop captures, rook captures, and captures on b2, then rook captures on b4, you control everything, and now you are going after the black king. So queen to d2, definitely a move you'd expect a 2800 Magnus to find, but here Magnus played the pawn to e4. He probably inspired by Kramnik in this game. He said, if you can sacrifice a pawn for some impressive play, I can do it as well. But now Kramnik's position is dominant. He's completely winning here, but you have to, well, figure out why. So feel free to pause the video here and win the game for Vladimir while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on taking down future world champion Magnus Carlsen. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is pawn to d3. That's the move. And we're just going to briefly explore some other lines, because this is a very, very complex classical game. Of course, bishop captures on e4 cannot be played due to queen to d2. And now the problem is, how do you defend? Queen captures on d4 is coming. Also, queen captures on b4 with check, even stronger. And if you play rook to d5, then comes this annoying, okay, you can capture on b4, but now just queen to e1. And you cannot defend. And now if you want to defend the bishop, you have to play rook back to e5, and now queen captures on b4, again very strong. King to e8, queen captures on c4. You've eliminated all of the pawns that will worry you in the future, and with Kramnik being down the exchange, this is not completely winning for Magnus. The real problem is, after this e4 move, what happens if rook captures on e4? Well, if rook captures on e4, then the trick is knight to c5. You attack the rook with rook to a7 coming, and there's no good way to defend this. If rook e5, you're just going to play rook to a7 with check, and after the king moves, queen to h7, there's no defense against queen captures on f7 checkmate and queen to g8 checkmate. So that's the problem. However, with pawn to d3, the move that Kramnik played, all of the variations that we've checked now work in Kramnik's favor, as his pawn is now on d3, not on d4. This drastically changes everything. And also, he freed up the d4 square for his queen. Once the queen lands on d4, he controls the entire board. f2, he controls b2, he controls the knight on a4. All of the squares will be covered that the knight can use to simply be useful this game. So really, really strong. So Magnus stops it. Queen to e4, queen to e3, and now comes bishop captures on e4. The reason why why Kramnik played bishop captures on e4 instead of rook captures on e4, rook captures on e4 looks a little bit weird because you might run into some queen c5 check and blunder the bishop, but it can be played. The rook captures on e4 would be a very strong move because queen c5 check is met with queen to d6, and queen to a7 with check is met with king to e8. That's the real trick. And after queen a6 going after the bishop, there's queen d5. And now after queen to c8 with check, you will play bishop to d8, and after knight to b6 going after the queen, what do you have? You don't have rook to e1 followed by checkmate. I hope none of you were looking into this, because if rook to e1 check, rook captures on e1 also delivers check and you blunder the game. But you can just play queen e6. You offer a queen trade and you're completely winning here, like captures, and the pawns are now too strong. So it can be played. Kramnik played bishop captures on e4 instead, also very strong, but requires less calculating. And now comes knight to b6. Sort of a move that doesn't really do all that much, but it's very hard to find a move here. Like if queen a7 check, you just hide the king on f8. And if you go rook to e1, which is objectively the best, then still bishop to c6, and you don't really have a good move. Queen to c5 check sort of wins the bishop, but not really. Queen d6, and after queen captures on c4 d2. And okay, that's pretty much it. Not much to be done here. But still, it would be the most resilient way to go. But after knight to b6, now Kramnik can pretty much do anything. It's merely a matter of moving the bishop from e4. He chooses the b7 square. The queen is hanging, and also bishop to b7 stops rook to a7 to come with check. And now, well, you could maybe even sacrifice the queen. Let's say rook to a7. You give up the queen first, a nice Zwischenzug, rook captures on b7 with check. After the king moves, you capture the rook, and okay, you do have now 2 rooks for the queen, but the pawns and c3, I mean the passed pawns are too strong. There's no saving this. So here Magnus tried the last maneuver, and he can't really use these squares. They're covered by the queen and by the rook, so the queen has to leave the defense of the knight on b6. Queen to f4 was played, and now queen captures on b6. Magnus played queen captures on c4, so okay, he stops c3, he cripples the pawn structure, but Vladimir no longer needs the pawn structure. Rook to e2 goes after the f2 pawn. Magnus played rook to f1, but upon playing rook to f1, he also resigned the game, as there is no stopping what's coming next. And what would come next is, of course, bishop to d4, and there's no defense here. The bishops are too powerful. Next move, you're just going to capture on f2, and whatever you play, I mean, bishop captures on f2, you resign. No stopping this. So yeah, brilliant game by both of them. Some very nice moves were played. Kramnik maybe with one suboptimal move, that king move to e7 instead of g8, but he knew what he was doing. He had a plan. Magnus also believed that he had a plan, and it worked out very well for former world champion Vladimir Kramnik. So you can see how even 2800 Magnus playing the Catalan with white is just very much different when you face someone who actually was world chess champion like Vladimir Kramnik here. I mean, spectacular play with the black pieces, you know, very exemplary to say the least. So yeah, this is the only defeat that Magnus suffered in the Corus tournament of 2010. Now you know which game it was. But he was still able to win the tournament full half a point ahead of Vladimir Kramnik and Alexei Shirov. And we're gonna cover at least one more game from this event, so stay tuned. Hope you guys are enjoying them as well. It's 2010 is the engine era, but it's not as much as the engine era as it is 2024. So you can still, players still go into these deeply analyzed lines, sometimes 10, sometimes 15 moves deep. Whereas nowadays with super engines, you take everyone out of preparation by move 2, by move 3, by move 4, and you get a crazy game, and it's almost impossible to prepare. And even when someone is prepared for like 20 moves, they even a super grandmaster will perhaps mess up on move 23 when he's out of prep, or maybe he mixes up his prep. So it's just a wild west what we have today. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Beautiful, beautiful play with the black pieces against Magnus Carlsen wielding the Catalan. I mean, what more could you ask for? I would like to thank Tom from Tipperary, John Anderson, Luke Donato, John Tardif, and BulletChestThriller.com for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.